Sinai page?
On YouTube and Facebook. Okay, we're live. Hi, everybody. Great to see you, and happy that you decided to join us tonight. You can see that I am going to be in conversation with Rabbi Noah Svi Farkas. Hi, Noah. Thanks for joining us tonight. I want to give a brief bio. I just took a little bit, Noah, from the VBS website. And of course, throughout the conversation, we'll get to know Rabbi Farkas and his mission and vision for his rabbinate. So Rabbi Noah Svi Farkas serves at Valley Beth Shalom, the largest Jewish congregation in the San Fernando Valley. He was ordained at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America in 2008, where he won numerous academic prizes in the areas of Jewish philosophy and Talmud. He's also a lecturer at the American Jewish University. Most recently, Rabbi Farkas led a 2-year campaign to address homelessness in Los Angeles County. He galvanized a coalition of churches and synagogues, along with many other organizations, to pass historic legislation that moved over $5 billion to build housing and services for the homeless and near homeless. I will let people know, okay, just getting information from Rebecca Small. Noah is an appointed commissioner and former chairperson of the Los Angeles Homelessness Services Authority, which oversees the regional strategy between public and private partnerships to end homelessness. He's been featured on NPR as a change maker, and he is a rising voice of faith leadership in Los Angeles. So I don't think you're a rising voice. You are a voice of faith leadership in Los Angeles. Noah and I have known each other for many, many years. We went to school together, been childhood friends with his wife. For me, how many, 20 years? Is that what you're 20 is what you're trying to say. We're old now, almost 20 years. Been very good friends, both at school, and have felt very lucky to have each other as colleagues here in Los Angeles and in the greater Los Angeles area in the Valley. And when Noah and I were discussing some of the topics that we felt were most pertinent during this pandemic, immediately homelessness has come to mind. Even today in the Los Angeles Times, there was a big article about homelessness and the fact that homelessness will grow 45%. There'll be an additional 250,000 people without shelter due to the unemployment rate. And it is incredibly scary. And before we get to where homelessness is today or your projections for the future, let's just hear more about you. How did homelessness become your passion? How did you get kind of driven into that issue? Or has that issue always been with you and then the rabbinate came after? Let's just jump into it. Let's just jump into it.
Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you perfectly. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't answer before. Sorry, before you start, I want to let everyone know that if you have questions, you are welcome to type questions into Facebook, type questions into YouTube, and then they'll be sent to me and we can answer your questions.
Great. It's so good seeing you.
Great to see you.
So you asked me about how I found my way into working for the homeless. So one of the things that is that a lot of people know about me is that I've always been involved in social justice in one way or another since I was young. Since I think even before we knew each other, I was involved in direct service in Africa at one point, and after Hurricane Katrina for a couple of years, I was very involved with the recovery efforts there. And then I came to Los Angeles and became involved with actually some environmental and food work, founding an organization called Natia, which became an interfaith food justice network, now housed at the California Endowment. And it was a number of summers ago. I used to live about a little more than half a mile from the congregation, and I'd walk every Shabbat. And to do that, I'd have to actually walk under the 405, where the 405 crosses Ventura Boulevard, right? Because I'm in the valley. And so I'd be walking, and then on the embankment there was a man. And I didn't see him at first because most people don't see homeless people at first. None of us are trained to do that. We actually just sort of accept them as part of the background of the
Yeah.
city, like a bus stop or a trash can even. And so I'd walk to shul and pass by him, and finally, like, he caught my eye and I caught his eye, and we started talking. And this happened every week, a little by little every week. And then some weeks I would bring him food from Shabbat Kiddush because we served a Kiddush, and we get to know each other. And I promised never to use his name, so I call him Jack. That's the name I use for him. And we got to know him. It turns out he was a veteran, and he was in the Iraq War,
Mm.
and I was a veteran. I am a veteran, and I also served in different capacity. And he came home with a lot of trauma, and blew through all of his benefits, blew through his friends, ended up on the street. Make a long story short, very tragic story. He ended up being addicted to drugs because he needed the drugs to get through his trauma. He just
Mm.
wanted to pass out at night because the nightmares were too strong. So he would drink his way or use some other kind of drug to fall asleep. And he ended up on the sidewalk, and we got to know each other. And then I think it was like early August, I was coming by, and he was sitting in the back of a squad car. The cops had come, and they brought a sanitation truck, and they picked up all the stuff and threw all the stuff away.
Mm.
And they wouldn't let me talk to him. And I was just trying to figure out what was going on. And it turns out he wandered too close to a commercial property, and the commercial property owner decided to press charges for trespassing, which was good enough as far as the cops were concerned at the time. And they were just gonna basically blow him off to some other part of the city. And that really left me reeling because I had started developing a relationship. I thought I was beginning the slow work of repairing his life, and being in service to him as a servant to our tradition. And that was now early August, and Rosh Hashanah was in early September.
Mm.
So walking home, I was very shocked. And 2 days later, Rabbi Feinstein and I were sitting in a meeting, and we're like, okay, we need sermon topics. And I'm like, this is what I'm going to talk about. And I gave a big sermon on homelessness, saying how this is going to crush our community. It's coming. There's a wave of homelessness that's coming. All the indicators, we knew ahead of time that this was going to be a terrible crisis. And it was coming, and we had to do something to get out in front of it. And I started a team at Valley Beth Shalom called the Homelessness Task Force. It was the first homelessness team anywhere in the city in a Jewish community. And we did a lot of research, and we ended up building a coalition, this fairly broad coalition that included churches and synagogues and mosques and schools and businesses, including on the charitable side, United Way, and on the business side, the Chamber of Commerce.
Mm.
And in the time that coalition was at its strongest, which was about 5.5, almost 6 years ago now, to now, and the coalition's in a different iteration today, but until now, they moved about $10 billion in housing and homeless services money across the state of California.
Wow.
And I'm not co-chair of the coalition anymore. Once I got appointed as a commissioner, I had to start giving up a lot of the grassroots role because they were starting to create some conflicts of interest. So Supervisor Sheila Kuehl, a good friend of mine, appointed me to the Homelessness Commission through the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority. And so I never intended to get into homelessness. It's sort of as, I can't remember who the philosopher was, said that we don't choose our circumstances choose us. And so I think it was Camus maybe who said that. But anyway, it found me. And rather than being a social justice rabbi who worked on every single social justice issue in the world and being angry all the time about everything, I decided to help one group of people in one city and to make a difference there. And that was several years ago, and I've been doing that ever since.
No, I just think it's so beautiful that Jack found you. And as much as Jack needed you in that moment, maybe Jack was your kind of angel, to give you a sense of what your calling is supposed to be. And I'm just curious though, explain a little bit more. Is the task force, is that still current at VBS? And, over the course of the years, after passing that, certain legislation, what are the different iterations of the task force?
We've had the task force at the very beginning.
Mhm.
It's still meeting. In fact, I had a meeting earlier today with the chair of the task force and our social justice coordinator, Nitzan Barlev, who works with me at BBS. We had a whole meeting today about new stuff that's coming up all the time. So it still exists. And in fact, we've gone to other synagogues and helped launch task forces at other synagogues. And that's been kind of an interesting experience too, which has been really great. I'm really proud of that work.
No,
So the
you
task
should take a lot of pride in that work. Sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to.
No, it's okay. Thank you. I appreciate
Mhm.
it. So it still exists. There's about 15 people who are currently on it. The membership kind of rotates through. People are interested in a project. They get interested for a while. They feel like they've done some good mitzvahs, and then they kind of move on. The core group, like the top 2 or 3 people, they're still have been in it from the very beginning, and this is their like signature mitzvah, their signature passion to Judaism. Most of the people who are on the task force would never come to shul on Shabbat. They won't
Really?
go to shul. Yeah, they're not going to come to a Talmud class. So this is their version of Judaism, and that's sort of one of my visions of Judaism in general. Is that davening, ritual practice, isn't for everyone. Learning isn't for everyone. Day school isn't for everyone. Camp isn't for everyone. So we should create platforms that allow people to express their Jewish life that meets sort of the path of their own soul in a Jewish way. And so the homelessness task force are folks who wouldn't have been engaged. They probably would have left the shul after their kid's bar mitzvah.
Mm.
But because we do this work, they stay and they invest in the congregation.
So I wasn't going to go in this direction, and I really want to get back to homelessness pre-COVID and now
Yeah.
current. But I just want to push you for a second because I'm just curious. So with that kind of idea, which, you and I are very like-minded, so you could easily push the question back on me. But, for the next congregant that comes to you and says, okay, well, homelessness isn't my issue, but pollution is, or whatever, you can, fill in the blank, but you're not necessarily the rabbi who can take on everything. How do you answer that person? Then why is there not a pollution task force at BBS? Don't get mad at me for asking that question.
No, you go to the
I'm
core,
just curious,
you go to the core of how I approach my rabbinate. If there's someone who believes that this is how their Jewish life will be expressed through Valley Beshalom, as opposed to, let's say, through another organization like Chazon or some other one,
Right,
but through
right,
Valley Beshalom, then my job is not necessarily to take it on myself. Like that's where your equation is wrong.
right. I hear you.
You and I are not Atlas holding the world on our shoulders, right? We're dance partners with the lay leadership. And if they want to pursue a climate change agenda, especially amongst our younger folks, then our job is to do some blocking and tackling to allow them to do that and support them through that process, not to do it for them.
No, I totally agree with you, but it certainly helps that this is your passion. I think that I would definitely
There's
want to
no
join
question.
I would want to join your task force because I know that your heart is there. And so then along those lines, tell me why it's Jewish. Why is homelessness in particular? What's the give me the Torah around it, or give me a few pieces of Torah around it.
There's so much
I know.
Torah
Like, what am
around
I?
so much.
Like,
Look,
what? Not just like what Torah is around it, but when you like, what immediately comes to mind? Which verse or which story, or like, what's the piece that you hold on to when you're out on the streets meeting these people that we should all be serving?
From Genesis, I learned that only one of our avot and imahot was never homeless. Abraham was homeless. Sarah was homeless. Jacob was homeless. They all wandered. They all ran away from home. And it was when, in that moment, that's when God said, you can be a blessing. Moses ran away from home and was homeless and used that understanding to free a nation. And then using that understanding, that is the purpose of why we take care of other people. 36 times in the Torah, it says, you shall take care of the stranger because you were a stranger. And there is no other people in the world that knows what it's like to be homeless for 2,000 years as our people. And I refuse to believe that we should continue the pain chain, and that just because we be homeless doesn't mean that we should allow other people to be homeless. And that we've been able to cross from over the threshold to find a place to rest our weary heads as a nation. We should hold the door open for others. That's what I believe fundamentally.
It's beautiful. It's truly beautiful. And I mean, to take on that notion that our matriarchs and patriarchs existed in this particular state, and that's who, you know, we hold on to. Those are the stories we tell. It's interesting, we usually don't tell that story. And
Never.
is that the story that you told for High Holy Days that year, for Rosh Hashanah? Is that where you started? Yeah, we never tell that story.
Think about it this way. Think about the book of Psalms, right? Shavuot is coming. We're going to sing Hallel, right? In Hallel, it says, Even ma'asu habonim hayta rosh pina. The stone that masons and architects would look at and throw away in the garbage is the stone that we use as our cornerstone. And there isn't a matriarch, a patriarch, or a prophet in our tradition that wasn't broken in some deep and profound way. Moses, the greatest orator in the history of the Jewish people, had a speech impediment. Ruth, who was a member of a tribe that we weren't even allowed to mingle with or marry with, lost her husband, lost her everything, ends up wandering and gleaning, and Boaz falls in love with her, and she becomes the great-great-grandmother of King David. Right? We take trash and turn it into palaces. That's what we're supposed to do, and that's what we're supposed to do as a society. And so that's where it comes from.
No, and it's just such a beautiful kind of reframing, and going back to what you said when you saw Jack, you know, how we're not trained to see the people who are around us. And that I thought you painted such a vivid picture that most of us see. We either equate the person with a trash can, or frankly, we'll see the trash can before we see the person. And what you've painted for us tonight and explained through your beautiful narrative is that, frankly, the person who's the most broken and the person who's before us every single day, they may have the answer that we desperately need. I mean, it's the broken figures of our tradition, as you said, that have basically moved mountains and moved people and created our civilization as we know it and created our tradition as we know it. But it is extremely difficult because our culture, as you said, we don't see the homeless that way. So let's move just for a few moments. Tell us, let's say, gosh, when did this all start? March, right? Yeah, start March. So let's move back to January, February. Where were you, either with the task force or your own work, the kind of the state of homelessness in Los Angeles, successes? Because I actually felt like you were kind of on a high with some of the successes that you have been achieving. So can you speak to that? January, February 2020.
Yeah. January, the last week of January every year is when the annual homelessness count happens. That's the census we take in night, right? So we had just finished that. We had some significant successes in opening up parking lots, working with the college, community college board, creating opportunities for beginning really creative thinking around, let's say, converted shipping containers, coming up with interesting housing options, working with the mayor's Bridge Home Project. And even back then, we were beginning to convert certain parks and recreation centers for temporary housing till we could build permanent housing down the road. We had some successes in building, we still have successes in building permanent supportive housing units in every city council district across the city. You know, they're slow in how they build. We had a new process of what we called motel conversion, where if a motel owner wanted to sell their property to the city, they would get a fair market value for that. And then in a month or two, you could convert the entire thing over to homeless housing. I had just finished speaking with Steve Lopez at Valley Beth Shalom when we were talking about the hospital project, that there was a hospital that was going to close, and we were going to talk about selling that. And the city
Wow.
picked that property up and had begun architecture work to remediate it so that it can be turned into homeless housing. So things are on a positive trend, although the fundamentals are still pretty weak, but they were on a positive trend. And then this tidal wave of a virus came here, and I give so much credit to both the county and the city for just acting quickly, dropping whatever they were doing, knowing that homelessness leads your chance of getting sick if you're homeless is like 50 times higher than it is if you're sheltered, and knowing that if this pandemic, it was as bad as they were predicting, that we would have piles of dead people in the streets. I hate to be so gross about it, but that's what they were predicting, is that, because think about it, if you're homeless, you don't have access to shelter, so you can't sleep well. You don't have access to a bathroom to wash your hands 10 times a day. You don't have access to clean food necessarily. And you're living so close to the
I was going to say
person
the
next to you.
close quarters,
That's
exactly.
right.
Right. I
And
mean,
we
the
had
encampment that we see. Yeah.
right, and we had, if you remember, we had a hepatitis C outbreak on Skid Row last year. And in some ways that was like a dry run. Like, what are we going to do? So immediately, I mean, city council offices sprung into action, putting up cleansing stations on Skid Row. Some people donated them, which was amazing. Sort of these like porta potty versions of washing stations. They moved the Parks and Rec program, just blossomed, and then we launched this program called Project Room Key. As soon as all these hotels lost all of their guests, we could start negotiating leases with them to use them to house homeless folks.
Wow.
And as
So
of
it started
today,
in March. That started already.
yeah,
That
well, that
immediately
the
launched?
negotiations, yeah,
Wow.
Soon they moved very quickly. They moved $135 million to do it, and of already existing money, and to repurposing money. And today, as of today, I think the report I got, there was something just under 3,000 hotel rooms, and that was servicing about 2,200 homeless folks. And the reason for the gap is because once we secure a room, there's a quarantining effort we have to do with the room to disinfect it before you can bring a
Right.
homeless person in. There's about a week to 2 week process just to do that. So there's always going to be a little bit of a leader gap. But yeah,
Wow.
so that's what they've been doing. And Project Room Key has been a huge success. It's being replicated all over the country. And it is incredible.
No, what about projections though? You know, as I mentioned, in terms of unemployment and the future of homelessness over, you know, the next 6 months to a year, what are the conversations that are taking place around that?
There are many conversations taking place, and none of them are good, Nicole. I mean, I want you to think about it this way. Leaving the humanity of someone who's experiencing homelessness aside and just look at the numbers just for a second, just to get systemic, okay? When you get sick as a human being, one of the ways that we know that you're sick is that we can take your temperature. And if your temperature is north of a certain degree, then that is a measurement about how sick you are. If you have a 99 temperature, you're kind of sick. If you have a 104 degree temperature, you're pretty sick, right? And we need to help you immediately. I think of the number of people who are experiencing homelessness as an indicator to the health of the society. Okay? So the society is less healthy economically, sociologically, environmentally, and in terms of public health, the more homeless folks you have. Okay? So we're going into this pandemic still pretty sick. At the height of the homelessness crisis before this, we were at 60,000 people. That's Dodger Stadium on the second night of the World Series, where every single person in attendance had to sleep on the streets. Like, that is what we're talking about in terms of how many people. So every economic indicator is showing us now that as people are losing money, they're pushing more and more people out of the system and onto the street. And then that's going to be coupled with the second tsunami coming from the other direction, which is that many of the things we passed, our legislation that we passed, are based on tax revenue. And starting July 1st, the tax revenue for next year, when people aren't getting income, aren't buying goods, and their home values might go down, the tax revenue is going to go down. And so we're looking at, I can't tell you the exact number, but it's close to 75, maybe $100 million less in funding for next year than we have now. So you have people entering into homelessness and the amount of funding to support them going down simultaneously. And that's why it's like really, that's where those numbers that you see are so scary are coming from. And I have meetings almost every day about what to do about it. I'm not a policy maker. I do citizen oversight over the money that's coming through, but we have to build, just like you do and I do at our own respective institutions, we have to build a budget. So I'm the chair of the finance committee for this agency, and I oversee a $460 million budget. And we have to project how much we're going to spend on this and that and the other based on our governing rules. And it's very challenging. It almost makes synagogues budgeting easy, I have to tell you. Almost.
It feels very naive to ask this question. But what can individuals do? I mean, in terms of, I want people to leave the conversation. By the way, if there's people who have questions for Rabbi Farkas, questions about this topic, you can feel free to type into the chat, and we'll do our best to answer the questions. But I do want people to, leave feeling like, okay, I understand the issue. I understand the severity of the issue. Is there anything I can do to help as an individual? Good. So how about, what are some of the easy steps and what are some of the medium steps? How about that? So if someone says, okay, well, this is, I have time for, a couple hours this month, or actually this is something that I'm really passionate about. Thank you for letting me know that here's a path. What would those avenues be?
Okay. I want to give we gave the apocalyptic version of this conversation, right?
Yeah.
Now let's give the most beautiful version of this conversation. In times of real struggle and stress, that is when you get to know who you really are as a human being. You shrivel up inside your house and refuse to engage with the world. Do you shirk the safer at home orders because you think rules shouldn't just apply to you? Do you, let your heart open and pour out to the community? And do you get active and do you do something to help? Right? It's in these moments where I think they act almost as a mirror. And this is where you actually get to see who you are as a person. And you might be different from one day to the next. And I'm not judging anyone who decides they need to take a break today. I'm not judging anyone who decides that they just don't want to engage because they're too afraid or they're too exhausted. I don't want to be judgmental, but it's where you get to know who you are. So when it comes to this situation, the first thing I'm going to say is, if you're a good person, be a good person. That doesn't change. If you are a good person on the inside and you think you're a good person, then act as a good person. So if you have only 1 minute to help someone who's homeless, the number one thing you can do is, if you're seeing someone who's homeless, let's say you're walking and they say hello to you, don't be afraid of them and just say hello back. You don't have to approach them. You don't have to touch them. You don't have to do anything except maybe look them in the eye. I wish they could see you smile, but you're under a mask. It's a little hard, but just be positive, okay? If they look like they're truly suffering, you should call 911. Let's be honest. If you saw your close friend collapse on the street and you didn't know what to do, you would call 911. Just because they're homeless doesn't mean that you shouldn't call 911, right? That's the suffering conversation. If you have more than a minute, if you have an hour, what you should do, if you can, is run a GoFundMe page to help a shelter, right? Raise some money. Not to raise a lot, but you can tell money's going to be a problem, so raise some money. If you have a day, these Project Room Key or hotels, they all need welcome kits, because we don't expect the hotels to provide shampoo and all of that stuff.
Okay.
And you can get a list. And if you need me to, I'll send you a list, Nicole.
I absolutely would love a list, and I'd love to later link it to this.
And then make a Project Room Key, welcome kit.
Fantastic.
If you have a week, Organize a group of 30 or 40 families to do the same thing and make 200 kits.
Fantastic. Great.
You can send food if you need to. You can send food to homeless shelters, or you can send food to these sites to help the people who are trying to help the homeless, because they're working on the front lines. If you have more than a week, if you have more than a weekend, you have more than a week, and you want to actually get involved, then you have to think about what are all the clusters of issues. You have to educate yourself. All the clusters of issues have to do with homelessness, for example. And forgive me if I feel a little too progressive at this point for some of your members and some of your community. But we know the number one thing that leads to homelessness is the fact that someone doesn't have a house to live in, right? And when I mean a house, it typically means apartment, which means that if you want to prevent more homelessness, you might have to push for rent forgiveness or mortgage forgiveness. And I don't know what that looks like yet. We don't know what that means in terms of policy and how to work with banks and all of that. But if you want to prevent people from falling into homelessness, you have to keep them in their homes. And that's a policy position. Right. And that policy position needs good legislators to figure out how to help landlords in that situation and people who have mortgages. But the truth is that if you want to prevent a homelessness catastrophe, in addition to a COVID-19 catastrophe, we have to figure out how to keep people in their homes because they're healthier at home, they're safer at home. That's what the words are, right? And then the last thing I'm going to say is we know that the number of people who are homeless, most of them before this situation, Nicole, were homeless for less than a year.
Right.
It really is just a rough patch. We get these stereotypes and the myths, right? The guy who's drunk or schizophrenic on the side of the road. That is a significant population of the homeless. That's about 20 to 27% of homelessness, but it's not everyone. The majority, that means the other 75%, are people like you and me who don't have friends and family who take care of them, or they were abused, or they had something and their husband or wife ran out on them and they were left with nothing and they had nowhere to go, or they didn't have the social skills to figure out where to be connected, and they're dealing with their trauma, and they end up on the streets for 6 weeks until they can figure it out. That's the majority of people who are homeless.
I mean, that was the story. I remember visiting domestic violence shelter, women's shelter. And I remember the story of one of the women's was willing to share and exactly what you just said. She said, you look at me and you might assume that the reason why I was on the streets is because of some kind of drug abuse or drug addiction. So the truth is, and I honestly, I can't remember what her job was, but it was a pretty high paying job. She said they were doing layoffs. She lost her job, no family in the area, started hopping from couch to couch of friends who were willing to take her in. And one night, she had already counted enough friends on her hand. That was it, there was nowhere else to go. But it was overnight. It was a crisis overnight. Her savings ran out and that was it. And I think if all we take, I hope there was so much more that people take from this conversation, but if all we take is that minute of looking, especially now, as you said, with our masks, but looking at someone else in the eye and realizing that, they too are made in the image of God. I feel like we've spread a little bit more of redemption into this world. But I know that, I don't know if you see the chat too, I know people really do want those listings of
like the shopping
of the different motels that we can be servicing, of different shelters of which we can be sending food. I'm sure I have many congregants who would like to be involved and help. Certainly we can post that on our own website, but I don't know if it's easy enough to type in. Is that what you're typing in? Okay, great. So are you saying though we just contact the Courtyard Marriott? Oh, never mind. Don't want to say that out loud.
Basically, I would not contact a site directly.
Don't contact the site directly. So
what do you want us to do? LAHSA, and LAHSA would distribute it for you. The reason why is because we don't want That's okay. We don't want volunteers congregating at
I
these
see what you're saying.
hotels.
Because of the gathering situation.
Yes, exactly. I'm not trying to be
Liability.
mean or secretive. It's really just if I tell you where the sites are
I see
and
what you're saying.
publicize where the sites are, and you come up with a 30 congregants who all want, right?
Right.
You're endangering the people who are working at that site.
Okay. So
Yeah, so it's just a matter. It's public health. I'm just trying, as someone who represents the government in this very sliver
no,
of the
we're not
conversation, I'm trying
advocating
to be
any gathering. So what website should people look to so they can do direct donations?
Yeah. You can always, in your area, for example, you have some really great organizations, both west of the 405. There's St. Joseph Center, which is the largest excellent homeless service provider west of the 405. West of the 101, kind of more towards Hollywood, your area, so north and east of you a little bit, is People Assisting the Homeless. That's a great organization called PATH.
Sure.
If you're living in the Valley, LA Family Housing, those are the three big ones. You can always give to organizations like Hope of the Valley Rescue Mission, Union Mission, Midnight Mission downtown, if you have relationships but if you're looking to do the overall service providers, those are the three on the west side that are considered the big service providers. And I send people through that because they share resources with smaller providers.
And if we contact any of those organizations, when you're talking about Project Room Key, right? Would they be able to give us the information of how to directly help that initiative?
Absolutely. You can also go to the LAHSA website, LAHSA, Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority.org.
Great.
And if I remember correctly, there's a way to do that. And then Nicole, after this, just email me and I can send you the resources too. Like I just, but there's always things that you can do. I think that, here's how I want to say this. I think that this is the question we're going to ask ourselves of the story that we're going to tell our grandkids.
That's right.
Because when I was young and I would listen to my bubbies and zadies talk about what it was like during the Great Depression and what it was like during World War II, right? And I remember sitting in an IHOP with my bubby and zadie, and my bubby would always take the sweet and low and packets of ketchup and put them in her purse. Not all of them, just a few, right? And I used to thought that was weird. Well, first I thought it was normal because I was so little. Then I learned that it was kind of weird. And then I realized that she's living her values in that time. She once told me you can make tomato soup from ketchup packets. And I was like, what a weird thing, what a weird way to make tomato soup. But then I realized she grew up in a world where that's something that you can do, right? Because you didn't have the money. So it sat with her, right? It sat with her. And this time that we're living in right now, as parents and as leaders, it's going to sit with us and it's going to sit with our folks. And so the question is, because the history hasn't been written yet, the question is, what are we going to tell them? What is the story of this time? We gave up, we changed our lives, we did nothing, or we put our shoulder to the millstone as every American generation faced with challenge did before us, and we pushed it forward so that our children don't have to go through what we're going through right now. That and our grandchildren, right?
I mean, I think it's a beautiful lesson to leave everyone with tonight. Something I've been asking myself every day is, what's my purpose during this time? What's expected, or what's God expecting from me right now? So not 3 months ago and not 3 months in the future, but today. That's what I wrote about for my Bessel Torah tomorrow. Hayom. I want God to strengthen me today so that I can fulfill whatever purpose I meant to achieve right now. And what I think you've really given so many of us tonight is just an extra layer to that purpose. I think you opened our eyes to an issue, which, of course, as you said, we know is there every single day. As you said, it's part of the fabric of Los Angeles. And yet you've opened our hearts and allowed us to see that brokenness is often the answer to finding a greater truth. And I pray that people take your words to heart whether it's a minute, a couple hours, a week, or a lifetime, that we choose to write the narrative our children and grandchildren will be proud to read. So I just want to thank you so much.
So good. That's so good.
And maybe next time, everybody, Noah and I will do a little bit, something a little lighter.
We should share recipes.
Okay, great. You're doing a lot
cooking?
more. I mean, not like you,
Oh.
Noah, over the holidays, I saw him, you were doing an orange peel, like a chocolate covered orange peel situation going on. I use my Instapot a lot, so that's been exciting. I was making a lot of soup. Maybe there's something about hard times and soup, but lots of soup.
Let's make soup. We'll make soup together.
Okay, everybody. Well, next time we'll make soup. But with that, I just want to thank you. And until next time, be safe and healthy. And Yasher Koach, thank you for your beautiful work.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Anytime. Okay, good night, everybody. Have a good night.